Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus. My name is Amber Elias, and joining me for this News Focus episode is Lewis Harper, Airline Business Editor and FlightGlobal's Airlines Managing Editor.
Hi, Amber.
Let's take a look at the top aviation stories this week on FlightGlobal. Embraer have cancelled development of a next-generation turboprop passenger aircraft, after having previously said the project was on hold due to insufficiently advanced engine technologies. Embraer had been examining the possibility of developing a new 70 to 90-seat turboprop to compete in a market that had grown stale. The only Western aircraft company still producing such turboprops is Franco-Italian manufacturer ATR. Airbus Defence and Space have handed over the first of two A400M tactical transport to the Indonesian Air Force. Indonesia becomes the 10th operator of the A400M, and the second aircraft will be delivered in 2026. Ryanair is to speed up pilot recruitment for the next 3 years as it prepares to introduce its first Boeing 737 MAX 10s in spring 2027. The airline states that Boeing is expecting MAX 10 certification in mid-2026 and that the airframer expects to meet Ryanair's contracted delivery dates for the budget airline's first 15 aircraft. Boeing has sold several digital businesses to investment firm Thoma Bravo for $10.55 billion, closing a deal that injects fresh cash into the company and reflects a plan by Chief Executive Kelly Ortberg to sharpen Boeing's strategic focus. The assets divested include Boeing's aircraft management software provider AirData and flight service information providers ForeFlight, Jepson, and OzRunways. Lewis, yesterday we both attended the World Travel Market 2025 in London. It was the first time I'd been to this event that covers the travel and tourism markets, and I was impressed about how busy it was. Was it the first time that you'd been to the event too?
Yeah, surprisingly. I mean, I've been doing this specific job for, I guess, nearly around 9 years now. So, it's, as you say, it's a travel and tourism event. So, yeah, that's probably why I haven't been there until this year. But there is a decent airline presence there. Obviously, it's an opportunity for countries and destinations around the world and service providers to show off their products and destinations. And so seeing it, yeah, it's very busy, huge. If anyone knows the Excel Centre in London, it was basically taking up the whole thing, I think. And that's a venue that can often have like 3 or 4 events going on at the same time. So absolutely huge event. As you say, really busy. We do a lot of shows like this, but it's rare to see something that so intensely busy, I think, at all points of the day we were there. So a lot of interest in travel and tourism. And really fascinating, I guess, to see the industry from a slightly different angle, even if I was still kind of focused on my airline brief while I was there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were some big names there, airline brands, and they had sizable stands. And it really showed that the demand for travel is strong. It does seem like travel has rebounded post-pandemic, even if the real traffic numbers don't fully paint that picture.
Yeah, you can look at, as we've talked about in recent episodes, really, there's a mix of experience in that regard. You've hit the nail on the head, really, regarding the general trend. Obviously, from an airline perspective, the tourism side of things isn't everything. There's a lot more to airline traffic than that, whether it's corporate travel, VFR, visiting friends and relatives, etc. But it is a big deal for most airlines. And that's really reflected in what we saw. And I think when we, for example, I spoke to the Egypt Air CEO there yesterday. As you say, they had a pretty sizable stand there as part of a big Egyptian contingent. Ahmed Adel, one thing he was really clear on was that the post-COVID demand for travel is continuing to trend, really strongly. There's plenty for airline CEOs to worry about at the moment, in terms of whether it's supply chains, geopolitical challenges, etc. But the one thing that's really holding up is that demand for travel. And, I mentioned some of the supply chain challenges. It also means that in many cases that demand can outstrip supply. And I think that was also echoed an airline CEO who wasn't at World Travel Market, Lufthansa Group's Carsten Spohr was on their earnings call a week or so ago. And for all the challenges, Lufthansa might be having as a group, notably including Lufthansa as an airline, which is having challenges with its profitability. The one thing underpinning the industry at the moment is that strong demand for travel, and Spohr was really clear on that in the earnings call, kind of saying, for all we've got to get through to get, the group really where they want it to be. What's really helping at the moment is that really strong demand for travel, particularly on the leisure side and even into premium cabins on the leisure side. And, that's supporting that journey that Lufthansa's going through and a lot of airlines are going through at the moment. And as I said, Spohr also acknowledged the fact that the lack of airline capacity in the market means that that's supporting yields and earnings as a result. But yeah, that gives an undercurrent of optimism, I think, in the airline industry. And when you see a bustling show like we did yesterday, that again gives you confidence that there's a lot of challenging geopolitical and economic news out there, but there is kind of that really strong underlying demand. And it was really, as I said before, really interesting seeing that kind of manifest itself in a slightly different setting yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also saw a new airline brand that we hadn't seen before, Riyadh Air. And they made a big deal of their launch in London. And on their stand, they were showcasing their interiors and the cabin setups. Even though the airline has only received one aircraft so far out of around 194 on order. So it's a pretty strong statement from an airline that is nationally backed, but is actually the second flag carrier of Saudi Arabia after Saudia, who also actually had a really big presence at the show and were quite forthcoming with you when you spoke to their chief commercial officer.
Yes, as you say, I spoke to Arved von Zermullen at the show, Saudia's CCO. And yeah, they're not for the first time. They're talking quite a lot about their strategy, not necessarily always being the most open airline in the past, but I think that kind of broadly reflects obviously Saudi Arabia's efforts to open up, particularly to tourism, and they're getting out there more now and speaking to journalists. So it was really interesting, and there'll be some follow-up pieces on that. Maybe we can chat more about that in the future, the specifics for Saudi. Obviously, again, this was obviously a travel and tourism show, and there was a massive Saudi presence there. And as you say, Saudi had its own pretty sizable stand there, showing off its product. It's got a long history, Saudi, obviously based at Jeddah and operating from several other airports internationally in Saudi Arabia. It's kind of, as you mentioned, Riyadh Air taking a lot of the headlines at the moment, but Saudi are obviously also on the growth path amid this big effort in Saudi Arabia to open up with its Vision 2030 program. So yeah, it was interesting to speak to them. You say Riyadh Air, of course, they have had presences at shows recently, but it feels like they've really stepped it up, certainly at World Travel Market, and that is reflecting the fact that they are close to making their first flight. Obviously, that is to London, so another reason perhaps why they had a big presence at WTM this year. Those first flights aren't fully open to the public yet, so there's a little way to go. And I believe their first sort of aircraft delivery proper is imminent as well. And I think at that point, they're also going to start serving Dubai. It's been telegraphed for a while. Riyadh Air, we've spoken to them on a few occasions in the past. As you say, at the show, they were displaying all of the kind of cabin products, even down to the food trays and everything else you can expect to experience on board. So I think it's fair to say Riyadh Air, we've I don't know if, certainly in my time in the industry, I haven't seen an airline kind of trail itself so strongly. We kind of know everything apart from what it's like to literally fly with them at this point. We've got quite a strong idea of the brand and everything and what's going to be going on inside the aircraft, but they just need to start flying, I guess. And it'll be interesting to see how they get on with Saudia and Riyadh Air. Saudia is already a relatively large Middle East carrier. Riyadh Air wants to be the same, as you said, with those dozens of aircraft on order. What's really driving that growth is the opening up of Saudi Arabia. So speaking to Saudi, there is a proportion of that growth where they want to also ramp up their position as a hub in the style of Emirates, Qatar Airways, or Etihad at points. So that is part of the plan. But actually, the real driving force of Saudi and the incoming Riyadh Air is expecting millions of passengers, more than they've had in the past. I think 330 million by 2030, which would be a huge rise on what they've seen before. If that's achieved, they do need Riyadh Air. They probably need more than that. There obviously is a lot of other activity beyond those two carriers as well in Saudi Arabia. Low-cost carriers doing a lot, but also worth noting that there is growing interest in Saudi Arabia from outside as well. So, an example might be Virgin Atlantic recently announcing it was going to serve that market. So, loads going on there, and it will be really interesting to see how that develops. They, really positive. I think in the case Riyadh Air starting up as a new airline, whereas Saudia is going through a big modernization process, sort of internally, as well as rebranding, having new onboard products, getting new aircraft in. So, as a market to follow, a really interesting one. I'd contrast it slightly. We've got India as a growth market where there's perhaps more kind of evidence that growth is definitely happening at the moment. I think Saudi Arabia, obviously, they're doing the part now, getting everything in place, and then we need to see what happens over the next 2 or 3 years or so, and whether that really starts to ramp up. There's some interesting dynamics obviously going on elsewhere in the industry at the moment when we look at what actually might be helpful for Saudi Arabia. For example, being on the Air France KLM call this week, it's really interesting to hear that the USA's new immigration requirements are starting to have an impact on passenger flows. So they've got tighter restrictions on people traveling from India and Africa, for example. And obviously, Air France KLM, as a hub carrier in Europe, is flying people from places such as that, and then on the transatlantic into the USA. And they've noticed a softness in some of those markets as a result of the travel restrictions in the USA. So again, we'll see how that develops, but certainly may prompt people to look elsewhere, and they're looking where to travel. Worth noting as well in that regard, I mentioned India before. We've seen this week, I think, that Indigo has started linking India with China directly. It sounds insane, but up to that point, for a long time, there had not been direct connections between India and China for a whole host of reasons, not least, I'm sure, geopolitical. Lots happening, whether that's new opportunities or opportunities becoming smaller in the case of the USA. So, a lot to watch out for, and Saudi Arabia will be among those markets we'll be keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. It does seem like there is a sort of repositioning of some of the hubs into the Middle East, away from Europe perhaps, and positioning them a bit more centrally across the continent there. And particularly if traffic to the US drops off, we could be seeing a lot more demand coming from China and other Asian countries.
I think, and you touched on an important point there with the Middle Eastern carriers. In terms of the hub function, where they're kind of connecting east with west, or however you want to put it, what is interesting is, yes, the European carriers are complaining a lot at the moment about their lack of competitiveness. That's often down to the extra costs they face because of certainly sustainability-linked initiatives in the European Union, for example, whether that's the emissions trading system or other taxes, whatever. So, one thing is, we talked about, I think in the last podcast I did, the massive profits that Emirates is able to make. I think while that is because they've got a successful business model, it's also definitely the case that perhaps they are more directly supported, whether that's through policy or otherwise, as an airline, as a national carrier. And I think in the cases of the Saudi carriers, it's certainly likely that they will feel in a similar position. They're part of a big push to build connectivity to that country, whereas I guess there's a sense in Europe that there's a bit more pressure, certainly on the sustainability side, to not necessarily fly so much. So, depending how it goes for the Saudi carriers, they've definitely potentially got a bit of a competitive advantage there, which may push flows that might otherwise have gone to Europe, for example, through those markets. But that's a way off yet. And I think there's a lot to happen before we can really truly see that that's kind of a firm fixture of the market.
And definitely Saudi Arabia think that there is an opportunity there because they have launched a second carrier. It's quite a relatively small country, obviously quite wealthy, and is doing a lot of work to reposition itself globally to make it, as you say, destination for tourism, but also, influencing through sport and other pop culture events. But obviously they're investing through a second airline through another city. So it will be fascinating to see how Riyadh Air fares when they eventually put their planes into the market, and hopefully we'll be able to see what the experience is like actually on board rather than just looking at the cutlery at the show, which is what we did yesterday.
Exactly. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see, as you say, how they get on. If you just a quick last point, if you talk to Emirates, for example, just proving the point that really the driving force with these carriers is kind of point to point, mainly to Saudi. Is I don't think Emirates is unduly concerned they're about to get a mega competitor on their doorstep in terms of the hub function that Emirates supplies, but there is undoubtedly a competitive element to what they're doing. But one to watch, and a fascinating part of the global airline industry at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode, Lewis.
Thanks, Amber.
FlightGlobal Focus is your new essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and on Monday for in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listeners can get a discount to a new subscription to FlightGlobal with the code FGPodcast. Terms and conditions apply. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.